Let's go.
Our mission, Helping Parents Heal, is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents to become shining light parents by providing support and resources to aid in the healing process. We go a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences and evidence for the afterlife in a non-dogmatic way. Affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background. Attendance today at this meeting is voluntary, and we are here for the benefit of learning from and sharing with other parents whose child has passed away. It is understood that our discussions are intended to be confidential and not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. However, these Zoom meetings are very healing to parents all over the world, and they are all posted on YouTube so that affiliate members who are not in our time zone can also watch. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers to allow parents to be informed about many possible ways to heal, to connect with their children, and to learn about the afterlife. The views expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect those of Helping Parents Heal, and we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Irene. And I'd like to just quickly introduce Fred. He's pretty amazing. And I'm very excited about hearing him speak. Fred Guttenberg began his public life after the murder of his beautiful 14-year-old daughter, Jaime, in the Parkland school shooting on February 14th. The day after the murder, Fred decided to attend a public vigil in Parkland. While there, the mayor asked him to speak. His words shook a nation, and he has not stopped since. Only 4 months prior to the murder of his daughter, Fred's brother, Michael, passed away in October 2017 from cancer related to his service in 9/11. He was one of the original first responders at the World Trade Center with a team of doctors who got trapped in the World Trade Center as it collapsed. Amazingly, the room that they hid out in did not collapse, and Michael and his team of physicians spent 16 days at Ground Zero taking care of others, following his involvement in these two distinctly American tragedies. Fred has traveled the country talking about both events, but also talking about perspective, perseverance, and resilience. He discusses pivotal moments in our life and how we respond to those moments. Fred's mission ultimately led him to write his new book, Find the Helpers. Fred and his wife, Jennifer, now spend time challenging our elected officials to do more. They began a nonprofit organization dedicated to Jaime's life called Orange Ribbons for Jaime. He has been a regular on TV news programs and a myriad of online and print media. Through the formation of the nonprofit, this is now his full-time mission. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming me and Irene in welcoming Fred Guttenberg.
Thank you for having me. I've done a lot of these events, the new world of Zoom, because of COVID. This is the first one I think I'm almost a little bit nervous for because of the reality of what we all share. And, it's one thing for me to talk to another group who really wants to hear my story, but can't put themselves in my shoes. And we can all stand in each other's shoes. And so I want to tell you my story. When I start speaking, and I was telling Elizabeth this before, I sometimes get going on a tangent. So I've asked them to kind of hold me accountable for time, because I also want to make sure I have a chance to hear questions from all of you and to talk to all of you. With that, here's my story, and here's why I wrote my book. Behind me, that's Jaime. That's my daughter. My daughter was a beautiful, amazing, competitive dancer. And there was a photo of hers after she was killed that went viral, became known as the flying leap photo. And an artist took that photo and made that painting for us. And I keep it there on purpose because I go through every second of every minute of every hour of every day with Jaime standing on my shoulder. She's always with me. That's how I go through life today. With that, I do want to tell you my story. Most people know me because of what happened on February 14th, but that's not when my story began. 9/11 is actually when it began. My brother was a physician, and at the time of 9/11, the deputy medical director of the New York Fire Department. He was in the World Trade Center when it collapsed. And amazingly, the room that he and about 10 other physicians hid out in, for whatever reason, did not collapse, but everything around them turned to rubble. When the noise of the World Trade Center collapsing stopped, my brother and these other physicians, rather than running and leaving, they stayed. And they spent the next 16 days at ground zero, breathing in all that toxic stuff. Years later, in 2013, my brother got the cancer. It started as pancreatic. That resulted from that. Surgery, chemo, radiation. Amazingly, my brother seemed to have beaten cancer until it came back in 2016. And this time his liver, his lungs, and his stomach. His last year of life was very hard. My brother is exactly 1 year younger than me. I am one of 5 kids. My parents are both still alive. My family did not know loss. We did not know grief. It didn't visit my family ever prior to that. Of course, there may have been distant relatives or friends, but not that close. My brother's final year of life and his passing was the worst thing I had ever gone through. I couldn't imagine anything worse. Until 4 months later, I sent 2 children to school, my son Jesse and my daughter Jaime. It was a perfectly normal February 14th in the morning, with one exception. It was the Valentine's Day that I intended to really introduce the romance of Valentine's Day to my kids. My daughter was 14, my son was 16. And so, being what I was at the time, which was just a sappy, goofy dad who did everything with and for his kids, I took my wedding video, which my kids had not watched because it was still on a VHS tape and we didn't have a VHS recorder in the house anymore. I spent the day before, on February 13th, digitizing that video. I bought this equipment, did it on my own. I was super proud, but I had like editing, finishing work to do on it. So on the morning of February 14th, I was rushing my kids out the door. They were running late, and I had a task I needed to complete. I wanted to finish that video so we could watch it as a family that night. My kids, being the typical siblings that they were running late and arguing about it and blaming each other. And all I kept on saying to them was, get out the door, get out the door. You got to go to school. I didn't finish it. I didn't say the words, I love you, as I was busy rushing them out the door. It haunts me every second of every day. It wasn't supposed to be the last second. I sent my kids to school to learn and be safe. Around 2 o'clock that day, I got a phone call from my son. My son is a jokester. So often you just have to take what he says with a grain of salt. And he said, Dad. I said, what? He goes, Dad. I said, what? He goes, there's a shooter at my school. I said, what do you mean there's a shooter at your school? I wasn't sure I was taking him seriously until he said, and I can't find Jaime because he watched after his sister like a hawk. They may have did this like siblings, but boy, did he love his sister and he looked after her. And when he said that, because he would never play games with her safety, I knew it was real. And I asked him where he was. And he said, I'm running with the other kids away from the building, but I can't find Jaime. I need to turn around. And I said, don't you dare. You keep running as fast and as far as you can. And he comes in, but I can't find Jaime. I said, run. I'll worry about your sister. The end of the story, we all know. I did get to my son. Over the course of that afternoon and into the early evening, we would learn my daughter was murdered that day. My amazing 14-year-old daughter, and let me just shut my email off on here so it doesn't beep. My amazing 14-year-old daughter was, and I'm speaking to a bunch of parents who are going to understand this when I say it, she was the best kid. She was everything a parent could have hoped for. She was tough. She was funny. She was the energy in my house. In my house, we either laughed because of Jaime or we yelled because of Jaime, but we always responded to Jaime. And she was tough as nails. She disliked bullies. In fact, in school, she would put herself in between kids if she saw one kid bullying another kid. And she was a petite little thing. In 6th grade, she came home from school one day and she said, I stopped somebody from bullying somebody else one day, and the bully was really big. I said, you can't do that anymore. You're going to come home with the black eye. And she goes, you know, Dad, you always underestimate me because of my size, being my tough little kid. So I pushed her, and she pushed me back. And I pushed her again, and she pushed me back. And the third time, I got what became known in my house as the kangaroo kick. My daughter had fast, fierce dancer's legs, and she was going to put a stop to it. When I got myself together, I just said, I should be really angry at you, but if anybody ever pushes you around again, that's what you do. I tell you this because my daughter would have done amazing things in life, but she's going to continue doing amazing things in spite of it, because I am her voice now. She is, as they say, the wind beneath my wings. She pushes me. She sends me signs. I know I'm on the right path. And I know because of what happened to my daughter, this world will become a safer place. I have no doubt in my mind. Because of what happened to my daughter, the next day, there was a vigil in Parkland. I went to this vigil, and when there was asked by the mayor to speak, I didn't go with prepared words, but I spoke from my heart and my head. And I went up there and I told the story of how I didn't tell my kids I loved them. And I told everybody in that audience, you make sure you tell people you love every chance you get by looking in their eyes with meaning, as if it could be the last time, because you never know. I spoke about feeling broken. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do next. But when I looked out into that audience, there were thousands of people. It was the very first time where it hit me. This was gun violence. The first 24 hours, it hadn't really registered. My head was spinning, but it did that night. And I walked into my house after the vigil, and I just said to my family and friends, I'm going to break that effing gun lobby. And that just became something I knew I needed to do. I didn't know how. I didn't know what the next step was. I just knew it was something I needed to do. About a week later, my phone rang. My phone was ringing constantly, and I wouldn't answer it because these phone numbers I didn't recognize. This time, the person left a message, and he said, Fred, this is Joe Biden. I want you to know that I understand you didn't pick up your phone and everything else, but I'd like to talk to you. I'm going to call you back at 6 p.m. tonight. If you don't answer, that's okay. I understand. But if you'd like to speak, make sure you pick up your phone. So I did. And we stayed on the phone for about 45 minutes. And he spoke to me. He wanted to know about Jaime. He wanted to know about Jesse. He wanted to know about my wife and me, and he spoke to me about his family and how he has gone through grief. He spoke to me about mission and purpose. And that phrase started to form the foundation of everything that I do. I knew I was on a mission, and he talked through the purpose with me. He then invited me and another Parkland dad to an event at a home that he was doing for the Bo Biden Foundation a few weeks later. And while there, we get there, there's got to be about 300 people in this house where the event is. So I was with this other dad. I figured we would shake his hand. After he shakes a bunch of other hands, he motions for us to come to a private room with him. And I figured we'll have 2 minutes. He asks us to sit down. 20 minutes later, I said, "You have a house full of 300 people. Don't you need to go?" And he just said, "This is more important." I was blown away. And he continued talking to us. And the thing I will tell you is he gave that dad and I the most meaningful advice of anybody to date about going forward through grief. You know, my rabbi at Jaime's funeral said, "We don't move on, we move forward." And so I've looked at my life ever since as this never-ending process of going forward. And Joe Biden spoke to us about how to do that. But the most important thing he did is he came prepared to tell me, I believe it was 92% of all marriages actually don't make it after an event like this. And he said, "I don't want you to be scared, because I want you to know so you have a plan to make sure that's not you." I still to this day can't believe he came prepared to talk to us about this. But he then started to talk to us about how no two people grieve the same way. We all grieve differently. And boy, that's true in my house. He said, "What's really important is that you and those you love all know right now that you're going to have your own way of going forward, of grieving. But you have to find ways to be okay with that, and then to be supportive of one another." In my house, that couldn't be more true. My way of going forward, of getting through this, has been this intensely public process. It's been this process of taking on people, of sometimes letting my emotion get the best of me, as happened, for example, at the State of the Union, which I don't know if all of you are aware of that, but I was at the last State of the Union, and when the current occupant of the White House made a statement about the Second Amendment and everybody, and that it's under attack, I said, "What about victims of gun violence like my daughter?" I yelled out. And for that, I got removed and detained. That's how I'm going through this. My wife, very private. My wife, very focused on our foundation and honoring Jaime's memory by really continuing to engage in things that Jaime loved to engage in, but in a very private, not public way. You know, if not for what Joe Biden said to us, I might have thought there was something wrong with us. Why are we doing this differently? But I understood. And it's one of the reasons why my wife actually wrote the afterword for my book, because she wanted people to know, because people always see me, they don't see her. And she wanted them to know her point of view about going through grief and how it is different, but how we're working through it. Following the meeting with Joe Biden, I went on this process of very publicly challenging our elected leaders. Excuse me. And one of the things I was doing through this process was something I'd never done before. When I was planning Jaime's funeral, the funeral director handed me a journal. He goes, "You ever journaled before?" And I said, "No." He goes, "I want you to consider starting." This is a gift. And he goes, if you do it, he goes, I think you'll get something out of it. And at first I thought, like, what is this? I don't write. But in hindsight, writing has become my therapy. It has become how I get things off my chest. I started journaling. And in April of 2018, I told my wife that I want to write a book. I want to tell our story of being a part of two distinctly American tragedies, one based on a foreign terrorist threat, one a domestic terrorist threat, and how this country has responded differently to both. And I wrote this book. It was my story. It was telling all the events that happened. I described my thoughts on these two different things, and I shared it with somebody who I really trust very deeply. And he handed it back to me, the manuscript, because you're not done. So what do you mean I'm not done? I'm exhausted. He goes, you need to keep writing. And I said, why? He goes, your story is really important. He goes, we already all know your story. He goes, I want to know about all the other people that show up all over this book. I want to know about them because you have some amazing stories to tell. And so I went home and I'm like, how am I going to rewrite this book? I just poured everything I have into it. But I started, and it took me about 6 months. And very early on in the process of rewriting, what became so clear to me is I don't get through any of my grief. I don't get to move forward from what happened to my brother or my daughter without every other person who surrounded me, who lifted me, who held me up, who carried me forward. And it then evolved into me really kind of going back to my roots. And I remember this quote from Mr. Rogers, where he said, my mother always used to say to me, whenever there's terrible things happening and tragedy in the world, always look to the helpers, the physicians, the firemen, the doctors, the police. And I could add so many other groups of people to that weren't in the quote. I did, like teachers and others. But he said, as long as there are helpers, there is hope. I said, that quote sums up how I feel. And that's how I ended up naming my book, Find the Helpers. Because ultimately, my story is one of all the people who were part of my life or who became a part of my life because of what happened to me. I'll give you some examples. The very first person who I became clear to me was a helper, someone I've never met. And it was on 9/11. When 9/11 was a very actively happening, we know my brother. We knew he ran into the World Trade Center because that's who he was. And hours into that day, when we didn't hear anything, we started to think the worst. By early afternoon, we were convinced of the worst. Until a lady that afternoon went by where they set up the triage and said, I'm sure you have people who want to hear from you. Just give me a name and a number, I will call them for you. And this lady later that afternoon called my parents just to say, I've spoken to your loved one. He is alive. He will call you when he's done working. That was the sign of life that we needed from my brother that day. It came from a helper who we've never met, but she got us through 9/11. And to this day, I wish I met her. I think of people like our next president who literally took the time to sit with me and say, here are the really important things I want you to know. Here's how I went through this. You may have your own ways, but here's what I would like to tell you. There was the night of the State of the Union where I was in handcuffs and Nancy Pelosi herself called the Capitol Police and said he is to be released and sent transportation to come and get me. And I'll never forget when I was in, it was one of her vehicles, and it was her driver. And I was being driven back to my hotel, and I was very upset. And I thought she was going to be upset with me. And she calls the car to talk to me. And I just apologized profusely. I said, I'm sorry for embarrassing you. I was your guest. She just said, what are you talking about? You spoke for America tonight. Don't you ever stop speaking, Fred. She was a helper to me on a night I needed it most. But, you know, I would say for me, the helpers that get me through every second of every day, my dear friends who know when I'm weak and know when I need them to lift me, and who also know when I need my space. My friend, he's like family, who on the day my daughter was killed, he's a police officer. When all the families were waiting for word, he went back to the scene to find my daughter and identify her, and has to live with that for the rest of his life. There's my other friend who took me to plan the funeral, who sat outside the room where I was planning the funeral, far enough away to give us privacy, but close enough to hear every word so that I wouldn't miss a detail. My life has been enriched by these amazing people. And the reason why I wrote this book is because what I really want people to know is that we do have a path forward. We never forget. We never forget. We always hold on to that memory. We always live with them inside of us. But we move forward. I tell my son and my wife all the time, really actually recently, it took me a while to be able to say this. But recently, I tell them, I'm going to be okay. I intend to be okay because I have a 20-year-old son. And I'm 55 years old now, not that you asked. But I tell you that because I tell my son all the time, I intend to be around for the next 50 years to make him crazy. I intend to be around for the next 50 years to watch him grow up. And I intend to enjoy every second of that. So I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to be okay. My daughter is with me every second of every day. She is making sure that we live the life that we need to live. And she's with us. The way I go through my days now, and for those of you who aren't on the 10 minutes of this phone call that I had with Elizabeth before, and I'm sorry with Irene as well, I said to them, I'm in a place where, very early on after Jaime was killed, I struggled with how to think of myself. I really did. I struggle with this notion of thinking of my daughter in the past tense. And, I'm a father. I only have one kid with me now. Until one day, I woke up and I said, I'm still a dad of 2 kids. I'm a father of 2 kids. And now the way I think of it is not that she's gone. I mean, she is. But I think of it as my relationship with her has changed. I live my life with her now every day. It's just different. And so these are things I do. I'm fully well known. We all have our different needs, but what I do want to tell everybody, and I hope everybody finds comfort in this. Know who your helpers are. Know who your people are. And if you're not sure, go to a place of worship, a community center. There's support groups, but have helpers in your life. I didn't know this until I wrote this book, but there's nothing I do alone. Everything I do involves other people. So know who your helpers are. Also, always know who you can be a helper to, because there's always someone who's going to need you. So know who your helpers are. I am thankful every single day. Sometimes my helper is someone who I actually have never met in person. It's Billy Joel. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'm a music fanatic and I'm a car nut. And when I'm having some of my worst moments, what gets me through it is I tell my wife and my son, I just need to go for a drive. Just me and my car and my Billy Joel music. And I get my head set straight. I do what I have to do, but we all have our ways. Know who your helpers are. Embrace your helpers. Let your helpers be a part of your life. Let them be there for you when you need it, but also, like I said, be there for others when they need it. So with that, I don't know how we're doing on time. I don't know how we're doing with questions.
Sure. No, we have some great questions, but
Okay.
I would just love if you would, before we take some of the questions, if you could share with everyone about the color orange and the
Yeah.
significance of it.
So orange was Jamie's favorite color. And the night she was killed, I called them her dance sisters. They got together at the dance studio and they started making fabric orange ribbons. Um, the next day they came to our house. They all went up to Jamie's room wearing their orange ribbons, and they gave orange ribbons to my family as well. And they had a very emotional gathering in her room, and they took pictures of themselves and posted it. These pictures went viral through the dance world, and the dance community dedicated the rest of their year and competitions to Jamie. And at dance competitions across the country and some across the world, wearing orange ribbons was the norm. Within 24 to 48 hours after that, Broadway picked up on it. And Hamilton and Lion King and some other shows dedicated performances to Jamie, and they all wore orange ribbons. So it was at Jamie's funeral, I talked about this start of an orange ribbons movement. I really didn't even know what that was yet. But about 3 weeks later, I was in a Home Depot and I was wearing my orange ribbon. I never took it off. And someone came up to me and asked me what it was for. And when I told them, they said, "Did you know that's also the color of the gun safety movement?" I had no idea. And it is true. Orange is the color of the gun safety movement. I went home that day and I said to my wife, I want to start a foundation called Orange Ribbons for Jamie. And really, the only thing I knew in that minute was I wanted to make the orange ribbon the symbol of the gun safety movement. That was all I knew in that moment, which, by the way, it now is. But what Orange Ribbons for Jamie is for our family, it is our way of keeping Jamie's memory alive. It supports programs that matter to Jamie in life, anti-bullying programs. Jamie was dog obsessed. My family is, so Humane Society. Kids with special needs. My daughter wanted to be a pediatric physical therapist. She actually dreamt of helping a child walk for the first time. And so we support programs around kids with special needs. We've started a college scholarship program, which we call the Kids of All Abilities Scholarship. It's got three main buckets. One is for a student who wants to go to school and major in something where you're going to be a helper to others, whether it's a doctor, a therapist, but you're going to help others. You have to have community service on your background, because Jamie did. And you have to have at least 1 year of dance, because Jamie did. The second bucket is a student who's going to go to school and major in dance, but they also have to have community service in their background. And then the third bucket, and this gets to the kids of all abilities, is for kids with special needs. There's not typically a lot of scholarships available for kids with special needs, but many of them, while they may not go on to traditional four-year college, they go on to other forms of post-high school education. And we want to make sure we're providing resources to them as well. So we call it our Kids, of All Abilities Scholarship. And, through our Orange Ribbons for Jamie, we will keep her memory alive forever. It also, we use it to educate on why Jaime's life was cut short, gun violence. But orange ribbons for Jaime is our way of making sure that while my daughter, for example, never got to go to high school, Jaime will send other kids to high school. She will help them be able to pay for it. We will make sure her dreams are realized in her name. And so that's orange and orange ribbons for Jaime. And I thank you for asking.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We've had people ask, and I'd love to know also, do you feel that you received signs from Jaime? And also, do you feel that your brother passed first so that he would be there to greet Jaime?
Ooh, I'm going to answer that second question first. That is an amazing question, and I never thought of that possibility.
Wow.
I don't know. I just know that ever since Jaime joined him, it's more likely she's taking care of him. But as for signs, we do get signs, and I'll give you two examples. One day I was visiting her at the cemetery, and I felt like I hadn't gotten any signs in a while, and I need these signs. And so I go to the cemetery and I say, I need a sign from you. And I said, for those of you who like music, you probably know the song Cats in the Cradle. It's like, one of my favorite songs. And my kids knew how much it meant to me because it's about a dad who really never spent the time with his kids that he should have. And how when the kids got older and he wanted a relationship with those kids, they weren't really there for him. And so that song always was the dad I would never want to be. And my kids knew the song, and it was just one of my favorite songs. So I go to the cemetery and I say, all right, here's the sign that I need. So I know you're listening. If somewhere between the drive home from the cemetery and our house, Cats in the Cradle comes on, I'll know you're listening to me. And what's important about that day is that night, it was actually Passover Easter weekend, almost 2 years ago. We were supposed to fly out to family that night, but because of bad weather, our trip got canceled. So I drive home and the song never comes on, and I'm disappointed. But, listen, it was a big ask. My trip gets canceled. The next morning, I go to the cemetery again because I'm not out of town. As I'm pulling into the cemetery, Cats in the Cradle comes on. And I'll never forget. Like, I'm sitting there listening to it. I'm ready to burst out to tears, and I'm recording it. And then all of a sudden, my wife calls, and I'm like, "You're not going to believe what's on the radio now. I got to call you back." So, but there is no doubt that was a sign. The other one, listen, I am convinced the Kavanaugh handshake was a sign from my daughter, because I was going through this process of wondering how much impact am I having? Am I making a difference? Are people noticing? And I went to the cemetery the day before the Kavanaugh handshake. And I'm having this conversation with Jaime. Like, when I go to the cemetery, if you drive by me, you just got to know I have full-on conversations. So I'm like having this conversation, and the next day the Kavanaugh handshake happened, and it just blew up in the news, and it made gun safety a huge part of the whole Supreme Court process, and it wouldn't have otherwise been. But I think the one that I remember most, and I write about it in the book, was about 3 weeks after she died. My daughter, for those of you with younger kids, you'll appreciate this. forget about having a screen lock on your phone. They figure it out in 5 seconds. And so I had a screen lock on my phone, but didn't matter. So my daughter put on random dates throughout my calendar this thing called Love Jaime Day. And Love Jaime Day was like a Valentine's Day on steroids. Whenever it would come up, I would chuckle, and then I would text Jaime, guess what came up on my phone? And she would just text me back with big hearts, all giggly. And that was like, but that day I had to like do this Valentine's Day thing on steroids with her. It's just the way it was. It was, so I tell you this because 3 weeks after Jaime was killed was my very first visit to Washington, D.C. And I'm walking into Congressional Office Building and my phone buzzes. So I look at it and it's a calendar reminder. It's Love Jaime Day. And I don't know how many of you have been to Washington, D.C. in front of those buildings, but there's steps that you walk up. I sat down on one of the steps and I fell apart. I just broke down crying. And then at some point after crying for a bit, I just said, Jaime just told me she's with me today. She just gave me a sign that things are going to be okay. She's with me. That while I do what I do today, she's with me. And I wiped off my tears and I got myself up and I marched forward and I started my very first visit through the halls of Congress.
Beautiful.
So yes, there's no doubt she sends signs.
That's just beautiful. Thank you. And we have a lot of people asking and talking about violence and gun control. Beth D'Angelo has a question, and it's my question
Sure.
as well. What words do you use when you're confronted by those who are gun owners and in fear of their guns being taken? And I have added to that, how do you address those that are talking about Second Amendment rights being taken from them? When the Second Amendment was written in our Constitution, there were no machine guns and assault rifles.
Well, listen, the idea that the Second Amendment is being taken away or people are going to remove guns from legal, lawful gun owners is the big lie, okay? But the big lie gets told to prevent anybody from taking any action at all. And so usually the way I address it, and to be clear, there's going to be a group of people who you're not changing their mind on this. You're just not. But the reality is the majority of Americans, and that includes gun owners, actually believe in the idea of gun safety. And so usually the way I handle that, I say, listen, 40,000 people a year in this country die of gun violence right now. How do you want to help me reduce the gun violence death rate? Let's start there. And that's usually how I frame the conversation, because at the end of the day, that's really all that this is about. How do we reduce the gun violence death rate? I was having an hour-long conversation with Senator Ted Cruz. Actually, Alyssa Milano, myself, and this other guy, Ben Jackson, were with him in his office. And of course, he wanted to live stream it because Alyssa Milano was part of the conversation, which was fine with us. And he didn't end up looking so well after the hour, so they pulled the live stream off the air. But at one point, Ted Cruz started in with that line of questioning. Well, the Second Amendment is under attack and you want to take our guns. I just said to him, I said, Senator Cruz, have you ever beat your wife or anybody else? And this is all in the video. And he looked at me like I was insane. And he said, no. I said, have you ever been violent in a way where somebody should fear you? He said, no. So I said, so you can pass a background check? He said, yes. I said, then what are you worried about? What are you worried about? When you frame it in a way where you put an end to the dishonesty, they don't have a lot left to say. Americans voted. In 2018, they voted to throw out people who wouldn't do anything about gun safety. And in 2020, they voted again. And we now are in a place to do something about the gun violence in this country. If you look at what's happening in this country over the past week, you see the consequences of doing nothing. That's going to change.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful. Teresa is asking, what can we do? What can we do to help you changing the laws? What can our parents do?
Oh, listen, I tell people all the time, the most important thing people can do is vote. I think in this country, people for too long started to think voting is a waste of time. My vote doesn't matter. They don't care what I have to say. They don't care what I think. I'm not going to bother voting because they're all the same. That was the mentality for too long. And so as a result, Americans did a terrible job of voting. And I don't mean when they voted for the wrong person. I mean, not enough of us voted. What we've seen now in the past two elections is Americans are starting to get that. And they're showing up and they're voting. And you had the highest voter turnout in this election ever. That to me is a fantastic sign. So as long as Americans vote, as long as we are making our voices heard through social media, through voting, by going, when your elected representatives hold town halls, there shouldn't only be 5 people there. Show up. Make sure they know you have something to say. Make your voice heard. We are getting a civics lesson in democracy these past few years, and especially these past couple of weeks, unlike any we ever thought. But maybe the most powerful, important thing to come out of the civics lesson is it will remind us how important it is that we vote.
Thank you. We have people asking, why are assault weapons not banned yet? Can you go into that a little bit about why they're in the hands of ordinary people?
A failure of leadership, a gun lobby that used money to hold legislators and legislation hostage, and that in the absence of enough people showing up to vote because they thought their vote didn't matter, people who represented minority thoughts were getting elected because only hardcore people were coming out to vote, but the majority of Americans were not. And so for many years that happened, and money influenced that process. AR-15s, assault weapons, they used to always say for hunting, it's for sport. And now, all of a sudden, it's like normal. They show up at government buildings and at peaceful protests. And they're used as weapons of intimidation on our streets now. That is going to end.
And do you think we need changes with background checks? Are there loopholes in background checks?
Well, so we do. And in fact, the House has passed a new background checks bill. The Senate refused to take it up under McConnell, but there'll be new leadership in the Senate now. It's going to come up for a vote, and it'll be signed by President Biden. I think the big change that we need to make to background checks, the big loophole we need to close, is extending it to ammunition. You have 400 million weapons on the streets of America today, many of them in the hands of people who cannot legally, lawfully possess weapons, and they walk into any old store and buy the bullets because there's no requirement for a background check. We should extend background checks to that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just want to read from Nancy what she's saying. She said, I can see why you have risen to become such an effective public voice, so riveting and true from your heart.
Thank you.
If I could whisper in soon to be President Biden's ear, cabinet position advisor, you'd be amazing. Thank you for sharing your story with all of us.
Thank you. I'm not sure, because I am For those of you who follow me on Twitter, I am very vocal about how I think and the way I feel. I'm not sure I would be great in a truly political position, but I will always hold them accountable. So.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about how your son is coping, how he is doing?
Yeah. And I write about his story in the book. The day Jaime was killed, I was actually worried about him because he wasn't that emotional at first. I was worried. It was like, it wasn't, maybe it was shock. I didn't know what to make of it. And that night, we all went to a Marriott hotel near where the shooting happened. It's where all of law enforcement was, where they were giving, notifications and everything else. We got home from bed about 1:30 in the morning. And I said to Jesse, why don't you stay in mom and dad's room tonight with us? I'll get the air mattress. And he just said, you know what? I'm okay. I'll go up to my room. And Jesse and Jaime, they each had their rooms upstairs. It was, they shared a Jack and Jill bathroom. And my son is noisy. He just is, and my daughter would go to sleep before him. And every night, like two siblings, they would argue because Jesse was noisy and she was having a hard time falling asleep. So they always worked it out. I didn't have to go up there to deal with it. They always figured it out. That night we came home. Jesse went back up to his room. And about an hour later, he came down to our room, just crying his eyes out, broken. And he just said, she didn't fight back. That's what broke him. And then he, started with the realization that he's an only child. He'll never be an uncle. And he went through some tough months. Thankfully, and I talk about this, he had this amazing group of friends, but my son also played ice hockey. And so between his friends and the hockey team and the fire cadets, because my son is going to be a firefighter, there was one person after another that had their arms wrapped around him all the time. Even though my wife and I should have always been in that position, we weren't always in the place to emotionally maybe be the best at that either at that time. But it all worked out because the amazing people that were there for him. My son is doing okay. He has survivor's guilt. He was part of that shooting too. He didn't die, thank God, but he wanted to turn around and run in and look for his sister. And to this day, he's convinced if he did, he could have saved her. And he couldn't. He would have been shot as well. But it's one of those things where in his mind, he'll never know that. And so, we work with these things, but my son is doing okay. He's on his path to becoming a firefighter. He idolized my brother. And so he wants this world to be in the world of first responders the way my brother was. And he's going to do that. He's going to, as he gets older and completes his education, he'll be taking care of other people, and he'll be great at it.
Great. Well, with your permission, before I ask you for just a few closing words, I'd love to read just a couple of sentences from
Sure.
your book that I just absolutely love. The biggest shift is not looking ahead anymore. I do not have a long-term view. It's one day at a time. The reality is that I now understand that life can change in a second, and nothing is more important to me than what is happening right now. Every day, surrounded by the love and support of my helpers, both near and far, I make the best of that day. On the next day, we start over. I just love that.
I used to always have a long-term view. And when I had my business, I was always the guy who every decision was not only about what it was going to mean to today, but a month from now, a year from now, 5 years from now. I was always planning out, and I don't anymore. I am day to day. I totally get things could change tomorrow, and I got to make the most of today. And so I work hard to do that. You know, just a couple of closing thoughts. I end my book with a message to our nation's kids, who I call our future leaders and heroes, but I really intend the message for everybody. And I talk about perspective, because we've all gone through moments in life when things have happened and we've thought of them as, oh my God, the worst moments ever. And then 3 weeks later, we don't even remember what they were. And I know, and I started this phone call by saying I'm more apprehensive talking to all of you than I normally would be, because I know every one of you understands now the difference between those old worst moments and what a real worst moment really is. But my message to the kids is about perspective. And I let them know, and again, I think this really is important for everyone. You're going to have moments in life, some just far bigger than others, sometimes in a really tragic, awful way, sometimes in a really amazingly wonderful way. But some are just going to be bigger than others. For me, what I've learned is ultimately what matters more than the moment is what you did next, how you reacted to it, how you responded. What did you do? How did you go forward? Ultimately, that's what defines every day after that. And so, as a final word, I just hope that we all can focus on how we go forward, on what we do next. When I was around 20 years old, and I'll paraphrase it, I write this, what my aunt said to me in the book. I was going through one of those moments that I thought was the worst ever. Honestly, I have no idea what it was, but in that time frame, I thought it was the worst. And my aunt just said to me, honey, whoever told you life was going to be easy? You know, she's like, whoever said that to you? She's like, it's not a straight path. There's bumps, there's potholes, there's sharp curves, there's big dips. She goes, but you know what? You keep going forward. And as long as you keep going forward, you'll find your way. And that is how I live my life now. No matter what, I keep going forward. I stay on my path, because I'm going to be okay.
Well, thank you, Fred. Thank you so much. And thank you for what you do every day. It's just amazing. And I'm sure, Elizabeth, you'd like to say
I'd
a few
just love to
words.
say thank you as well. That was absolutely beautiful, Fred. And we are so grateful at Helping Parents Heal. I know that what you said resonated with us probably even more than a lot of other people that you speak to. And I know that it is intimidating to be with a group of people who have been through the same thing, but you are definitely so inspiring. We always ask everyone to unmute themselves and say thank you and goodbye
Thank you,
before the
Fred.
end of the meeting. So yes, so go ahead, everyone, and say thank you to Fred.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Fred.
Irene.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you,
Irene.
Fred.
Taking care of the
Thank you,
gun
Fred.
thing.
You're amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
That was just
Thank you.
wonderful.
It
And
really
we hope
was.
to maybe have you back sometime soon if you're willing
Yes.
to.